Let's see what this rather long allegory evokes for us. A long time ago, there was a queen and a slave who gave birth to a child simultaneously. Now the midwife who was attending the births was a crone, a hag, a witch. She delighted in interfering with the ways of life. It gave her a sense of power. So she switched the babies so that the prince became a slave child, and the slave child became a prince. Now the old hag gloated about this, and she longed to tell somebody, but of course she dare not. But then one day she could not resist. She stood at the open window and whispered gloatingly what she'd done to the open space. But the wind took her words and brought them to the ears of the birds, and the birds discussed it between themselves. And deep in the forest there was an old hermit who understands the language of the birds. And when he heard this, he immediately whispered it to everyone who came by. So pretty soon the whole kingdom knew, except the king and the queen. Now, as time passes, the king and the queen died, and the slave, who was a prince, became king. The first thing he did was to exile the prince who was a slave. He dare not kill him because he feared that there would be an uprising against him. So he exiled him to a far distant place. But the slave who was a king was never comfortable, never at ease. He always remembered that he was a slave. So to try to assuage himself, he would go on hunts. There was a time he went out hunting with an entourage, and he followed a deer deep, deep into the forest. He was fixated on that deer. The day passed, and the night was falling, and his entourage says, "Sire, we have to go back to the palace. There are ghouls and demons and animals in this forest. We have to get..." But the king was fixated on the deer. He said, "You go back, leave me." So the slave, who was a king, continued his hunt until night fell. But then there were the eerie sounds, the screeches and the wails and the cries that filled the night. So he hastily climbed a tree. Now, as it so happened, the prince, who was a slave, had come into being owned by a certain merchant, a cattle merchant, who bought his cattle from place to place. One day, as they were traveling, 3 of the cattle escaped, and the merchant ordered the prince, who was a slave, to find those cattle and not come back. If he didn't come back without those cattle, he would get a big beating. So the prince, who was a slave, went into the forest to find the cattle. But they dispersed everywhere. Each time he tried to gather them together, they ran off again, until, of course, night fell, and he too was deep, deep in the forest. So he climbed a tree, preempt what comes from here. As the prince who was a slave was sitting in the tree, he heard a cough. And there was the slave who was a king in the same tree. So of course they got talking, and the slave who was a king related his story. And immediately, of course, the prince who was a slave knew that he was here in this tree with the usurper of his kingdom. But he decided to keep quiet in case it was decided that the king would slay him. But you know, the slave who was a king had not eaten for 3 days. He was ravenous. And it so happened that the prince who was a slave had some bread and cheese in his bag that he carried around his waist. And when he took it out to eat, the king begged him, I'd give anything for a crust of bread. Oh, said the prince who was a slave, what are you willing to give? I'll give my kingdom for a crust of bread, said the slave who was the king. So the prince who was a slave said, done. I will take your kingdom and you will be my slave. And they shared the bread between them. When the morning came, the positions had been completely reversed. Both the slave who was a king and was no longer a king but now a slave, and the prince who was a slave who was now a king. So looking out at life, the now king thought to himself, I have no desire, I have no need to chase these cattle. And I have no desire to enslave anyone. I know what it's like to be a slave. So he turned to the slave who was now a slave and said so, and said to him, you're free to go. I can see that you still long to chase that deer. Go, chase the deer. So the now slave clambered down the tree. The cattle were there standing by, and the deer too. But the slave went in pursuit of the deer and was not seen again. But the king, now a king without kingdom, descended from the tree and followed a path through the forest. And somehow he came to a walled city. Now when he came to the gate of that city, he was greeted by the gatekeepers who said, you cannot enter here. This is the city, the kingdom that has lost its name. You cannot enter here unless you are willing to restore the name of the kingdom. Now the king was very perplexed by this. He had not expected to be greeted in this way, and he said, I have to ponder on this. So he turned around and left and went back the way he came, into the deep forest. And again night fell, and the sounds of the forest, the screams, the screeches, the wails, sent him up a tree. But as he was resting in the tree, he began to hear music such as he'd never heard before, lilting in his ears, and as it swirled around and through him, he felt light and peaceful and fearless like he'd never felt before. And he felt within himself that perhaps he could restore the name, the lost name. But the next morning, the music was gone, and he descended the tree and he wandered throughout the forest in the day, wondering if the music would come back again. That night, again, he climbed his tree, and there it was, the music. But this time, he felt a great sense of peace and fearlessness. So, in the deep of night, he descended the tree and followed the sound, the music. It seemed to guide him. And as he traversed the forest, he looked up. And there, in the branches of another great tree, he saw a bright light. And he could feel that the music was emanating from this light. So he climbed the tree, and the music surrounded him, and the brightness of the light swelled, and he went into what you would say was a trance. This trance lasted the whole night. And when he came out of his trance in the morning, he felt as though he knew all the sounds had meaning for him. Now, when he looked, instead of being the blazing light that was there throughout the night, when he looked in the tree, he could see what seemed to be an instrument nestled in a branch nearby. So he reached over and found that indeed it was an instrument made of the finest wood. And in the wood were engraved hieroglyphs and symbols he'd never seen before. But when he looked at the symbols and the hieroglyphs, he knew what it meant. And he knew that he could restore the name of the lost city kingdom. So taking the instrument very carefully, he descended the tree and followed the path back to the gate of the city. And when he arrived there, the gatekeeper again asked him, "Are you willing to restore the name of this lost city?" "Yes," said the king. And the gate was opened for him. But the gatekeepers related to the king, inside the gate is a garden, and those who have entered before have been greeted by screeches and screaming wails that sent them racing out of the gate. The king was ready. He entered the garden that lay inside the gate of the city. And indeed, he heard the screams and screeches and wails. But to his ears, they were no longer the screeches and fearsome wails. He immediately immediately recognized them as the souls, the lost souls, wailing for release. He entered the garden, and as he convened with these spirits, they came to his aid, and they entered the city. Now, the spirits knew that this city had to be restored to order, and so they took it upon themselves to do just this, putting things in their place. But as they were doing so, they came to the center of the city, where there was a little fountain. And in the fountain was what appeared to be a throne, a wonderfully engraved wooden seat. The king immediately recognized that the wood of his instrument and the wood of the throne-like seat were the same hieroglyphics, the same etchings. He very lovingly placed the instrument on the throne-like seat, and immediately a music began to emanate, floating out across this city, across this realm, and all could hear that it was the lost nave of the kingdom city. Now, the gatekeepers, of course, knew. They too had heard the music. They too recognized the name. They too were rejoicing. And, of course, we know that, without saying, that the king was invited to be the king of this city, of this realm, of this kingdom. And in due time, he embraced his own kingdom, that which was his birthright, and annexed it with the kingdom of which he was now the monarch, so that there was a great and vast realm of peace, harmony, music. Allegories, their symbols, their deep meaning for us. We recognize our journeys, that which has happened for us. But can you now, and this is our need, can you now translate, give expression to what it is that this allegory means for you relative to your own spiritual journey? What does it mean? What was the city that had no name for us? What was the instrument that we found? What was the music that led us on. What was it that occurred to allow us to have oneness and understanding of all languages, all sounds? Speak up now. It's time to give voice to your story. Your story.
saying of the gateless gate, and that we somehow so striving to go there, to know how it works, how we get there, whatever comes up for us, and how we strive to go there, and we all come back where we started, in a way, and yet not as we started.
Hieroglyphs on the harp that played music is like the laws, the divine laws, and bringing that into the mind so that your actions are also harmonious, and the souls in torment is like from
It's
those
music,
harmonies.
isn't it? It's music, yes. Even the music of our mind. It was discordant before.